welcome to Tell Us Your English's extended coverage of the 2018 presidential elections in Venezuela. I am Soini Gray.
And I'm Camila Escalante. Welcome to our election coverage.
Okay, so we're going to start with this report of Election Day in Venezuela.
Fireworks. They mark the beginning of the electoral day. The event is called Toque de Diana, and people line to vote before the polls open. The caravan goes around different neighborhoods, playing songs for people to wake up.
On this day, we're celebrating peace. We're celebrating joy. We're defending our sovereignty. Millions of Venezuelans are going to mobilize to defend our people's future.
According to figures by the Ministry of Communication, by 10 a.m. Caracas time, over 2.5 million Venezuelans had casted their ballots already.
I am proud to be Venezuelan, to have this reliable and secure electoral system, and to be able to exercise our right as Venezuelans to take part in democracy.
Current President and candidate Nicolás Maduro was one of the first Venezuelans to cast his vote. He remarked that this was a day to defend the country's sovereignty.
This is a battle for our independence, for our sovereignty, our democracy, and for peace. Today is a historic day that no one should miss. I encourage those who haven't woken up yet to do it, to get ready along with their families, because today is the time for the big democratic family of Venezuela.
Venezuelans today have raised their voice to tell the world what kind of future they want for their nation, and the outcome of the polls will certainly mark a new stage for the South American nation.
So that was just a brief report on how the day has been so far. Polls have now been closed for about 30 minutes, but we expect that some people are still in line because that's a law in Venezuela. If you're in line when the polls have closed, you will be allowed to take part in the elections. Absolutely. But now we thought it was a really good time to look at the international coverage of the elections because it's been really interesting. Camila, I know you have some articles that you think that we need to pay attention to.
So here at Tell Us Where we follow the international media. Of course, we need to know what they're reporting. Even though we cover Venezuela and we have many correspondents on the ground and we know exactly what's going on there, it's important to see what's actually being reported in the international news. As we know, there's a media war against Venezuela and Maduro's government. The first article we have is from The Guardian. It says that President Nicolás Maduro is set to win the election despite the economic crisis. It's a very
And what you thought about that article, Camila?
Well, it's one of many that are somewhat pro-Falcon, which is really interesting because I'm sure that a lot of these outlets and journalists who are from the global north didn't even know who Falcon was ahead of this election. That
headline is actually really kind of funny. Maduro would be Jesus.
This is another article from The Guardian. So both of them are actually very pro-Falcon, and they say that they say that he would even be beat by Jesus, which is actually a really funny statement to say given how, if anyone knows anything about Venezuela, it's very Catholic, very Christian, and that's certainly not the case.
So it's also slightly sacrilegious.
Right.
Okay.
But what they're saying is that, of course, if there wasn't a boycott that was called by the MUD, by the opposition, that support would all go to Henry Falcon. I'm not sure that's the case. I think a lot of people would say that, in fact, if more people really wanted to vote for Falcon and really wanted him as president and really knew that the numbers were that high, that 65%, let's say, if people really wanted to support Falcon, I think they would actually go out and vote for him. So clearly he's not that popular.
He's not new to politics.
He's not new at all. He's been in politics for, let's say, 20 years. Just under 20 years, and he was served 2 terms as governor of Lara State, he's been mayor, and he has a very high profile. So clearly, people are not rallying around that candidate.
It might have something to do with the actual candidate and not with anything other than maybe the candidate is not what the people want at this point in time.
And Falcon even came out in one of his recent press conferences saying that if elected, he would bring in some of the other people from the opposition, including some people like such as Henry Capriles to serve as a minister for him.
Minister of the Interior.
Exactly.
That's what he was saying, Minister of the Interior.
Right, so he sent some invitations for them to join him, as well as he invited all of the other candidates outside of Maduro to join him and concede their campaign during the last few weeks. And of course, none of them did except Ratti was the only one to join.
It's important to say at this point that the opposition officially, or the MUD, still have a boycott of the election.
Absolutely.
Which is why it's really funny because the narrative from Falcon and Batucci has been, listen, if you're not happy with the existing government, you need to actually take part in the electoral process.
Right, so they've been echoing those calls for boycotts, but of course we'll see later on what the turnout ends up being and how much of a vote Falcon and other candidates receive, to see if Venezuelan voters even heeded those calls at all.
Right. You said you had another article first?
Yeah, another strange article that was put out late yesterday by the New York Times in the US. It's called Pimping Out Venezuela, and it's talking about the exploitation of beauty pageant contestants. It's talking about
which is interesting because beauty pageants are like a big thing in Venezuela. They have like the highest number of Miss Universes in the world. I mean, I know when I used to care about beauty pageants, I always knew, okay, Miss Venezuela is guaranteed top 10, top 5,
absolutely.
Top 3.
But this is kind of just an attack on the moral character of Venezuela. It's an attack on, it's trying to somehow connect the beauty pageant industry and some other illicit dealings with the government just by publishing this right before the election. And of course, on the front page of the New York Times, there's no other coverage of the elections that are happening right now, which is massive for the region.
But I mean, if Venezuela is like a normal country participating in, with normal people in it, one of the things that the New York Times has actually been really known for covering is the Me Too movement, which deals with intrinsic sexual harassment, I guess across the board. They started with the entertainment industry. And the impression that I got of this article is that it's basically exposing sexism within the Venezuelan beauty pageantry, which means that Venezuela is not immune to some of the problems that everybody else has, which is intrinsic in Hollywood and other industries.
That it's a normal country, and then somehow at the same time trying to connect that back to Maduro's government and saying that this is how things have been under Maduro.
Could you talk a little bit about how they're trying to make that link? Like, how is this a Maduro problem? This particular the issues with the beauty pageants. How is that a Maduro problem?
Well, it says that there are companions for wealthy sponsors, people that have been trying to be suitors for these beauty pageant contestants, and they include the highest levels of the Maduro's government. But it doesn't necessarily name people or give specifics. I think it's just slander on the night before the election.
To try and discredit the president who's campaigning for re-election.
Absolutely.
All right, any more articles first?
And just our last article is from Canada, CBC, which is known as the state media, but we don't actually call it state media. We only call it state media when we're referring to Telesur, and when we refer to Russian media, of course. But this is just another article that talks about their predictions at CBC, which is that they're saying, of course it was taken from Reuters, they're saying that Maduro is going to win despite the economic crisis, and describing how severe this economic crisis has been.
So
but
this
not
is
really
also very similar to was it the Guardian article that had the sacrilegious headline that he would be Jesus?
Yes.
So it's very similar in tone.
But on CBC, they're not saying anything about the fact that people are headed to the polls in very large numbers, and they've said nothing about the fact that the Canadian government sent a message to the foreign minister of Venezuela saying that they're not allowed to install the voting tables, and there was a lot of
meaning that they're not
unknowns
allowed
about
to
that.
vote in the embassy in
The
Canada.
consulates in the 4 different cities in Canada, and a lot of Venezuelan Canadians had no idea, including one of our guests yesterday on From the South.
Okay.
We spoke to Nino Puglicia, who is from Vancouver, and he was planning on voting as a Venezuelan Canadian in his local consulate, and he was not able to do so, but he didn't actually know he wouldn't be able to vote until today. They were still trying to figure out, are Venezuelan consulates, embassies, are they Venezuelan territory? Can they still set up those polls? This was something they didn't find out at all about until today.
Now, I remember earlier this week we had reported on that. Jorge Ariasa had responded saying that it's really unfair that the over 5,000 Venezuelans?
Over 6,000.
Over 6,000?
Yeah.
Okay, that's quite a bit. That's quite a bit. Okay, so since we're talking about the elections in Venezuela, I think it's really important to show you this video we have of President Nicolas Maduro. Polls opened at 6 this morning. He was actually one of the first in Caracas to exercise his franchise, and we have video of that in a few for you, or in a moment. I'm hoping they bring up the video right now. And also, we've been talking about how the international media is saying that Maduro is expected to win today's elections. And we were discussing that he could even beat Jesus, which is, I thought, I really like that headline. It's very funny and disrespectful. But I think we want to show up that video of President Maduro voting. I'm just waiting for that to come up on screen, but I think it's also important to say that the voting process in Venezuela is something that the country is very much accustomed to. The Venezuelans on staff have told me that they are accustomed voting. It's not a problem. It's actually like a party or something that they enjoy doing, and that at least around 10, I think Quito time, or 10 Venezuelan time, over 2.5 million Venezuelans had already exercised their franchise. One of the things that we've been hearing is that the turnout for today's election is not going to be as high. They expect a low turnout, partially because of the opposition boycott. So that should be interesting. And you're watching video behind me right now of President Maduro voting in Caracas. So he was literally the first person to enter his ballot, presumably for his own candidacy.
And though we said a lot of media and a lot of people are predicting that the turnout is going to be a little lower, and that is because of the boycott that's been called, I wouldn't say that takes away from the election day excitement. We saw 3 nationwide elections in 2017, and it's always very exciting. People always line up at the polls very early at 5, 6 in the morning. This morning, we heard reports and we saw video of people saying that they were actually at the polls at 3 a.m., so even earlier. So even if it turns out that the turnout was lower today, people were just as excited and in fact more eager to cast their ballot.
The ones who decided to exercise their franchise were very excited. Now we have our correspondent in Caracas, Ian Bruce. We're going to head to him now. He's been out since, I think as early as 3 a.m. I saw Ian saying that he was out and about getting ready to cover the elections. Polls have been closed for about 40 minutes. 40 minutes. So we need to talk to Ian, who's in Caracas, to tell us how the day has been. I love that tie, Ian Bruce. How has the day been so far?
Good evening, Sereni. Good evening, Camila. Yes, indeed. It has been a long day, not just for me, but for most Venezuelans. The voting, as you say, started in theory at 6 o'clock, but we were out there at 5 o'clock, and we were talking to people who'd already been there for an hour or more before that, lining up to vote. There was that very lively display of fireworks at 5 o'clock, the so-called toque de ayana, which is a tradition in Venezuela to call people out to vote. There were people playing drums, playing music. It was really a party atmosphere well before dawn. And that really set the tone for the day, I think, because it has been a very, very, I would say, tranquil day of voting. There really haven't been any serious incidents reported. The electoral authorities themselves said they'd had 4 minor complaints of issues, minor issues. 2 of them had been dealt with. 2 of them had been dismissed because actually nothing had happened at all. But really nothing of any seriousness to report at all. It's been very peaceful and very good-humoured. I think those are the 2 adjectives I would use to put for this day, because I think people, like those people who are out at 3 o'clock in the morning or 4 o'clock in the morning, they said, you know, we want to vote. We want the Venezuelan people to be able to decide their future. We do not want anybody else to interfere. We don't need interference from outside. And that was the tone that was set very early in the day. Now, you're absolutely right. Turnout will be an issue. We don't know what the turnout was, to be honest. What we saw this morning as we traveled across Caracas from the Far East in Petare, a number of voting stations in Petare in the east of the city, to Catia in the west of the city, was in the morning there were a substantial number of people lining up to vote, a substantial number of people. I mean, I cannot tell. I have been at previous elections in Venezuela. I honestly can't tell you whether it was less or more or the same as previous elections I've been at, because it varies a lot from one voting station up. But it was substantial. That did decline in the course of the day, no doubt, but that's also quite common. You know, people come out to vote early, then they go home, sort out their business. It gets hotter during the day, so people don't want to go out. And then there was, I think the crucial issue we're going to have to look at is how far did it pick up again towards the end of the day? There certainly was, in several of the voting stations we went to, an increase in voters towards the end of the day. Difficult to tell how widespread that was because we only went to 3 voting stations at the end of the afternoon. There was an increase of voters again at the end of the afternoon. Whether that was enough to raise the turnout or not, we'll just have to wait for the result, the turnout figures.
Ian, I know you'll have some interviews with observers. I know you've been at different polling stations throughout the day, but what have you heard from some of the international delegates as they observe these elections?
Absolutely. I mean, unanimously impressed. I think that's the short answer. Unanimously impressed with the efficiency of the voting system, the technological level of the voting system, which is pretty well unparalleled, I think, certainly in this part of the world, almost anywhere in the world, I would say. This fully automated system of voting, it began to be automated in 2004. It's now completely automated from start to finish. And then there is a paper ballot, as we've talked about before, a paper ballot in parallel with the electronic vote so that the two can be compared. That's something that's going on right now, of course. The audit which they do, this is one of the most important of audits they do of the electoral system, which is that after the votes after all the voting stations have closed, they take 54% of those voting stations and compare the paper ballots in the box, which are just meant to be a reflection of the main vote, the electronic vote, and make sure that everything tallies perfectly. So the international observers were impressed with the technology, and they were impressed with all that audit system, and think they were above all impressed by the spirit with which people were voting. Very calmly, very good-humouredly, but also quite determinedly. With a certain determination. And so I spoke to the ambassador of the African Union in Washington, who was one of the more senior observers here. I spoke to representatives from Mali, from Canada, from the United States, from Argentina, from a number of countries. And everyone was basically impressed with the calm, impressed with the good humor, and impressed with the voting system itself.
Thank you so much, Ian Bruce, for that update. Now, we're going to be going back to Ian later on in this program because Ian is going to have a very special interview for us, and he's going to give us little details when we go back to him. But you just heard Ian talk about or make reference to the ambassador of the African Union in Washington. Her name is Arikanya Chihombori Kwao. She described the electoral process in Venezuela as nothing but peaceful. And she says she's also very concerned. She regretted the negative way the media has portrayed Venezuela.
What I'm finding on the ground is exactly the opposite of what I thought Venezuela was like. So far this morning, I've been walking around town, visiting different voting stations, nothing but peaceful. People are going on about their business on the streets, in the voting centers. The military are guarding the voting stations to make sure there are no shenanigans going on. I have witnessed what they showed us the past 3 days in terms of what was going to happen. And today, I'm actually seeing that process in action.
Okay, so we just saw that interview. She's saying that she's very disappointed, very concerned about the narrative of Venezuela, especially since that she can see, we haven't really spoken on this show, but we have in the past in previous episodes of From the South, our reporting about Venezuela's electronic voting system. Now, of course, I'm not going to try and explain that to you now because it's very detailed, but we do have, if you go to the Telesur English website, telesurtv.net venezuela.org/English, we have a special tab called Venezuela's Vote, where we detail the voting process. They've been using electronic voting for quite some time, and the system that they use, the Smartmatic Vote System, can't believe I remember that name. They use biometric activation of the voter authentication. That is the other hard word. Authentication of the machine, which means that you have to use your finger to activate the machine. So for me, where I come from a system where we don't use that, I'm very intrigued by the discussions of fraud, and that is essentially what the African Union rep has said, that from her experience, the narrative of Venezuela that she heard does not match up with the narrative of Venezuela, the reality of Venezuela that she's
and it's
seeing.
Extremely interesting to hear from her, and hopefully a little later on, I don't know if Ian can get us some interviews, or if we'll get some clips from some of the interviews during the day of people at the polls from delegations from Africa, the Caribbean, even Asia, and even the US, because of course the US is where the media is based that's been waging this media war, this propaganda war against Venezuela. But it would be very interesting to hear in places like neighboring Caribbean and Africa and Asia what kind of information they're getting and why they thought it was so important to come all the way to Venezuela to observe these elections.
Well, we're going to have a special treat for our viewers. I think in the second half of this program, we have an interview with David Abdullah. David Abdullah is the President General of the Movement for Social Justice, which is a trade union or social organization based in Trinidad and Tobago. David was supposed to be at Venezuela now observing these elections, but he has experience observing past elections. He was there in October. So he's going to talk to us about his experiences acting as an election observer. So we're going to have conversations from people, as Camila said, from Canada, because I believe the person that Ian has, I don't have all the details on that guest, but the person that Ian has is actually from Canada. I mean, earlier on in the week, we did speak to a gentleman, Don Friedman, from the Canadian Postal Union.
Yes, Donald Foreman from the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. But Canada, of course, has had a bit of a strong tradition of leftist activists and people from various parties and unions who've always gone to observe the elections in Venezuela and throughout Latin America. So I'm particularly interested in who Ian might have spoken to out there at the polls who came from the US and of course these other countries. I think now we're going to look at some reactions from Twitter today as the elections were underway.
Go into the reactions, because you're saying you wanted to hear comments from other people. We have a tweet up now. If you go to the Tell Us Your English Twitter account, which is literally at Tell Us Your English, we have examples for the entire day of persons that Ian has interviewed talking about the voting process. You can see how disabled people can vote in Venezuela and how people have been responding to the process. What's this tweet?
So we're looking at a tweet from Bolivian President Evo Morales, which has been a president, Evo has been very close with Maduro and his government, as well as the rest of the leftist governments in the region. He says, "We regret and reject the unilateral decision of the government of Canada to prevent our Venezuelan brethren from their right to vote and elect freely their government. Human rights are universal, and Canada is a disastrous precedent for attacks on political rights on immigrants." So this is speaking to the 6,000 people that Jorge Ariaza said were registered to vote at any of the 4 consulates in the major cities of Vancouver, Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal, who up until today had no idea what was going on, as it was announced 4 days ago by the Canadian government that they were not allowed to set up the polling stations in the consulates as was laid out by the CNA. So another tweet we have is by former Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa. He's of course, he's
in Caracas right now.
He's actually serving as an election observer in Caracas, and he says that the elections are being carried out with total normalcy as far as he can tell. As an observer, he's attended 4 polling stations, and this was hours ago, so by now he might have seen a little more. Permanent flow of voters. He says the turnout is totally normal, and short wait times and very quick. Seamless there, and he comments on the very modern system. He says, "From what I've seen, it's impeccable organization."
Yeah, he made this like just before midday today. I mean, I'm saying just before midday today, but I'm not too sure what time zone this tweet is registered in.
Exactly.
So that is a bit of a concern.
And then we have one last reaction, but we don't actually...
But before we go to that reaction, I just want to let our viewers know we have an interview with Rafael Correa done by Ray Gomez on Tell Us Your English and Tell Us Your Spanish, talking about why he's in Venezuela for the elections. So that's something that you can look out for, especially if you want more news and more coverage of this very special day as part of our extended coverage of the Venezuelan elections. Camila, I'm sorry I interrupted you.
The one last reaction is actually, it's not a tweet, and it's not from the social media account, but it's from a radio interview.
Let me stop you again. Please forgive me, because we need to go to headlines now. We have an update with Kijan Haynes in Studio B. Kijan, what do you have for us?
Thanks a lot, Soyini. You're right. I am Kijan Haynes. And let's get you guys caught up with everything that's been happening today in Venezuela. Of course, we know now that polls are closed. It's all over. The counting begins. And we won't find out exactly what the final numbers are until the CNE is happy that they have a clear winner. So let's look back on what happened today. As you said, Nicolas Maduro was one of the first to cast his vote in Caracas just after the polls opened at 6 a.m. And he spoke of the need to guarantee peace in the country. That's what this vote would do. And later in the day, when word came from the U.S. State Department that they weren't planning to acknowledge the results of the election, of course we've known this, he held another press conference to denounce that decision. And he said, despite the criticism, the historic results will represent the views of the majority of voters.
By the end of the day, and after knowing the final results, I know that our people will peacefully defend and acknowledge them. Today is a historic day for Venezuela. There has been a fierce campaign coming from Donald Trump's government to damage our electoral process. But they failed. They tried to stop this, but they couldn't. I said it before, no matter what, there will be elections on Sunday, May 20th, and here we are. Let's wait for the people's will, which will be totally respected by ourselves and by the world.
And when Foreign Minister Jorge Arias cast his vote earlier today, he said the international opposers could not prevent the people from exercising their right.
The Venezuelan people defended with joy their independence and sovereignty. They have always believed in democracy and the right to vote. These years of revolution have been based in democracy, the right to vote, and civil participation.
Let's look at some of the other voters. Now, opposition candidate Henry Falcon was actually the last person to cast his ballot today. Well, the last of the presidential candidates, that is. Falcon cast his ballot in the hometown of Lara. Now, he is Maduro's closest competitor in the polls, and he denounced what he called some irregularities in the voting.
We have received up to 350 reports on red points, where social security cards were being scanned. This goes against the agreements we signed to hold these elections. It's shameless. It's supposed to be points of assistance, but it's being used by the other party. There has not been response against this. We want the president of the Electoral Council to take measures.
An evangelical candidate, Javier Bertucci, voted in San Diego, a city in the Carabobo state. Now, he told reporters he wanted transparency in the votes as well, and he too had some issues with the location of the red points.
We have more than 380 reports on red points. We asked the CNE over and over that these red points should have been at least 200 meters away from the polling stations, but we have received reports that the red points are right next to the polling station.
And President of the CNE, Tibisay Luceno, was asked about these red points in a press conference. Let's listen to what she had to say.
We've been paying attention to every report of irregularities in the process, 4 in Barquisimeto, 11 in Lara that were actually solved, and 1 in the capital district. We've also received a complaint in Zelaya in the San Francisco municipality regarding assisted voting. I want to remind you that it is illegal to vote escorted by 1 or more persons. We'll keep an eye on that because we do not allow it. Every specific complaint has been carefully investigated and treated, and we ask you to keep being very specific so we can properly work with any issues.
Of course, the fourth presidential candidate, Ronaldo Quijada, voted in Aragua. Now, Quijada is one of these four candidates. He really hasn't had the prominence of the other three. He's been running on a platform of morality and ethics in politics. Now, after he voted, he said there were some issues with the ballot, which could confuse the voter, but otherwise, his voting experience was smooth. And of course, one of the major aspects of this election is the number of international observers who have been invited to witness the elections, one of whom is former Spanish Prime Minister José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero, who is observing the process. Now, he says Venezuela needs peace and stability. And he also reminded people of the importance of resuming the national dialogue in the country.
The first thing Venezuela needs is peace, stability, and to avoid any risk of conflict, and of course dialogue and consensus. If I had to choose one word to describe the electoral process today, it would be peace. That's the essential word before, during, and after the electoral process. I think a national dialogue is necessary and above all, imperative. As I have always said over the past years, I have to mediate the process, and of course I would be open to collaborating once again and helping a country that is facing problems and that is close to me like Venezuela is.
And of course, those are the headlines at this hour. Remember, we are always online at telesurtv.net/English. Soyini and Camilla, back to you.
Okay, so those were the headlines on Tell Us Your English in this special extended coverage of the Venezuelan presidential elections 2018. Camila, I understand that you have some more videos, well, websites actually.
Websites, yeah,
yes,
a little
to
bit
share
more
with us.
media coverage. So earlier we looked at some of the international media distortion in the dominant media that is primarily from the US, the UK, but other countries as well. And so what we have here is a couple of websites. The first is Venezuela Analysis. And of course, Venezuela Analysis should have thorough coverage of Venezuela, as it's called Venezuela Analysis. It does do a couple things on the rest of Latin America, but what makes it even more thorough is that this week they've organized a delegation to observe the elections themselves. So they're on the ground and they have, of course, all social media, and they are covering everything every day that, for example, Telesur would cover, and these small stories, and it paints a better, more thorough picture of what's going on.
More comprehensive view of what actually happens in Venezuela.
Exactly.
So one of your criticisms of the stuff that we had before is that they didn't necessarily have people on the ground, or they weren't giving a truly representative...
They have no footing there,
right.
And they rarely speak to anyone who's actually in Venezuela. Who they do speak with are some Venezuelans who have now moved to other countries, who
so
are
they
largely...
naturally would be disaffected. I mean, you know, people tend to migrate for a variety of reasons, but if you migrate for political reasons, it's usually because you're not happy with the current political structure, so your views are going to be skewed.
They may have moved for a number of reasons, but they tend to be people who are supporters of the right wing.
Right.
That includes the MUD coalition, which has called for a boycott of these elections. So that doesn't paint a very fulsome picture of these elections. The other one I wanted to bring up is rabble.ca. And rabble.ca is from Canada, and it's another media outlet which has organized to have people on the ground as election observers. And of course, Canada and Minister Chrystia Freeland, the foreign minister of Canada under Trudeau's administration, has had a lot to say about Venezuela. They've been organizing with the Lima Group, and they've been kind of hearing a lot from the Venezuelan right-wing community, and not so much from people actually living in Venezuela who continue to support the Bolivarian government. So rabble.ca wanted to go there for themselves, and so they have a blog, and they've been tweeting as well some of their activities, and hopefully we'll get to hear from them a bit later.
Okay, so that's interesting because you keep talking about the right wing. Is it that those international, like the New York Times and the Guardian, tend not to listen to left wing or socialist voices?
Right, they're picking and choosing their their sources.
Right.
And this is an issue. Back in the first article we spoke about in the earlier segment, we were talking about The Guardian. The Guardian actually quoted us. They quoted Telesur, but at the same time...
They quoted Maduro via Telesur.
Exactly. They quoted Maduro via Telesur. And that's funny because the whole article was built against Maduro's government, but they had no other sources. Maybe it's because they don't have Spanish translators, maybe because they don't have access to any of the Venezuelan channels. So they actually have to come to us to find information and then go and distort it themselves.
That's an interesting analysis. Okay, so we are supposed to be going to Ian Bruce a little later on in the show because we want to talk to the election observers. So earlier this week, we had a conversation with Ozzy Warwick. Ozzy Warwick is a member of the Movement for Social Justice. Now, Ozzy told us in that conversation, I hadn't been aware of it before, that he also has experience observing elections in Venezuela. The Movement for Social Justice had a seminar last Saturday about Venezuela because they said, well, Ozzy is going to explain in this clip that we're going to share with you that there's a lot of misinformation in Trinidad and Tobago and I guess elsewhere about Venezuela, and they felt it was really important to address some of those concerns and also talk to people about the electoral system in Venezuela so that they would understand how to look at the news about Venezuela, especially today, of today's interview. So we're going to go to that video, that clip with Ozzy Warwick, and that was him speaking on From the South on Monday.
And we felt it important to have this seminar because there was a lot of disinformation being presented here in Trinidad, not just by the U.S., but in terms of in Trinidad and Tobago, certain organizations in Trinidad and Tobago. And we felt that as a progressive movement, we had a responsibility to ensure that the people of Trinidad and Tobago get the truth, the real truth about the situation in Venezuela, especially in terms of the electoral process, to show how democratic indeed it is. With David Abdullah and myself having been international observers at previous elections, but we also thought it important to put the whole situation of Venezuela into context, in the context of U.S. hegemony and the attempt by the United States to influence the Americas. We felt that it would be important to have that discussion in a very in-depth way with persons from the social movements as well as from the party.
Okay, so we are supposed to have a conversation with David Abdullah, but we're having a little bit of a technical difficulty. Now, the reason why we want to have this conversation with David is because David has experience looking at elections in Venezuela, because I think it's really interesting to hear about elections, but I think it's also important to not just talk to the voters and the people who are contesting the elections, but talk to people who have experience actually observing the elections. We have David now. David is the President General of the Movement for Social Justice. So he is actually a comrade of Ozzy Warwick. David, thank you so much for joining us. So talk to me. You have experience observing elections in Venezuela. How do you find the electoral process there?
Well, good evening to you and to all of your viewers. Yes, I was an observer last October for the elections for the governors of the states in Venezuela. And I visited quite a number of what we in Trinidad and Tobago would call polling stations, centers where people voted. And at those centers, which were schools and other public buildings like that, there were a number of different actual polling stations. And I was able to observe the process from persons being checked with respect to their ID card number, and then that ID card number would correspond to their name. They then had to put a electronic thumbprint to ensure that that individual was who he or she said they were. Then they were allowed to vote with the electronic voting machines, which also generated a printed ballot, which they put in the ballot box, and then they signed the register, which had their name, their ID number, their age, their gender, and they signed their name to that, and they also put a physical thumbprint with ink on it. So in my view, the process was very free and fair, And actually, there were more checks and balances in the electoral system in Venezuela than there are in Trinidad and Tobago.
Can you actually expand on that, David? Can you tell us a little bit about what you've seen in Venezuela compared to some of the other election systems you've seen, including in Trinidad?
Yes, because there are different means of verifying both the voter as well as to verify the number of persons who cast a ballot, so that the verification of the voter is not in Trinidad and Tobago is only by showing your ID, your photo ID, whereas in Venezuela, in addition to showing your voter, your ID card, you also have to put an electronic thumbprint. So therefore, someone might forge an ID card, but they certainly cannot forge a thumbprint, which thumbprint must correspond with the ID card. So that is one verification measure which is stronger in the Venezuelan system than it is in Trinidad and Tobago. Secondly, with respect to in Trinidad and Tobago, it is a paper ballot which is used, and those paper ballots are counted. In Venezuela, there is both the electronic registration of your ballot, because you use the computer screen and indicate the candidate of your choice. But in addition to that, it also prints, the computer prints a paper ballot, which you then place in the box. So in the event of any inconsistencies, the paper ballots could be cross-referenced with the electronic ballot that had been cast by the voter. And then you sign the register and put a physical thumbprint on the register after you're voted. So in my view, there are more checks and balances, both with verifying who votes, that the persons who are eligible to vote, in fact, vote, and there's no voter fraud in that regard. And then secondly, the ballots can be cross-referenced both electronically and physically if necessary.
Now, David, the MSJ, the organization that you're head of, thought it was really necessary to have a seminar last weekend. Why was that so important?
Yes, we joined together, the Joint Trade Union Movement, to have a seminar for our activists and members and other interested persons about the electoral process, because there has been this attempt to delegitimize and discredit the electoral process in Venezuela, and therefore to delegitimize and discredit the outcome of the election, assuming that President Maduro and the PSUV and the coalition of parties with the PSUV were to win the elections tonight. Because if you discredit and delegitimize the electoral process, then whoever wins becomes delegitimized. And if you delegitimize the winner, assuming that's you then create the condition that we wanted to ensure that we in Trinidad and Tobago had the right to be able to put out. This was very important because days ago, right, was a seminar at the university where the university brought someone who is an attorney and so on, to present the case for the delegitimizing of the election process. So it's important that we had that first.
Now, I have one last question for you, David. Now, we've been looking at international articles for the entire day. I saw one where they said the observers in Venezuela are actually sympathetic to the government. Have you been contacted by any international organizations who wanted to get your experience having observed elections in Venezuela and what you thought of them?
No, I haven't. However, the Trinidad and Tobago media, one of the media houses, TV6, which your colleague Kijan Haynes, I was very familiar with, having worked there as a journalist, has asked me to come on tomorrow morning on the program to share my own knowledge and experience of the Venezuela.
Thank you so much for that, David Abdullah. So we've been talking to David Abdullah of the Movement for Social Justice in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, we promised you an interview that our correspondent in Caracas, Ian Bruce, has. That interview, I understand, is ready. So we're going to head on over to Ian in Caracas. Ian Bruce, are you ready? Hello, Ian. How are you?
Indeed, Soini, thank you. Thank you, Camila. Yes, I mean, you've been talking about the international monitoring mission here in Venezuela. I was talking earlier about some of the impressions that I'd heard from international monitors during the day. And we're very happy to have with us one of those monitors. He is Mohamed Al-Sadi, and he is the director of the International Department of the largest private sector union in Canada, UNIFOR. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, good evening, Mr. Bruce.
I wonder if you could start, Mohamed, just by telling us what you saw today.
Well, we started by visiting a number of polling stations, and I think we saw a good number of them, and there was at least a huge lineup in a few stations. The system appeared to be, I think, one of the best systems that I ever seen.
People keep saying that, but what does that mean?
Well, I think the fact that you have a ballot system, a paper system, and also you have someone fingerprinted to identify the individual is very unique. I think the United States could learn something from how you conduct elections in Venezuela.
Go into that, because actually one of the observers, monitors I was talking to earlier was from the United States, from a social movement in Georgia, in fact.
Yes.
And she said, you know, Mr. Trump's conception of free elections could learn some lessons from what's going on here in Venezuela.
Well, I think Mr. Trump could learn lots of lessons from not just Venezuela, from other countries. The reality is, look, what we saw today, people who were excited about the right to be able to vote. They were voting without any interference. We saw people with disability who were able to also be helped to get to the ballot station and vote. I did not see anyone being prevented from voting or being intimidated to go and vote.
What about the atmosphere? What did you?
Well, it was I could only describe it as happy atmosphere. People were very, I think, excited about the fact that they're going to vote, and people were socializing outside the polling station and talking and chatting, and some of them were singing, so I think it was quite interesting.
I mean, I think it's your first time in Venezuela, but obviously you've traveled a great deal.
I have.
I think one of the things that often surprises people, even when they sort of know this beforehand when they come to Venezuela, is the huge disconnect between what they actually see and hear in Venezuela and everything, almost everything they were told about Venezuela before they arrived.
Well, that is part of the reason why our delegation decided to come in. We wanted to, you know, apart from the fact that we were invited to be monitors, we were also invited by the labor movement here to talk about, you know, the relationship between the unions in Venezuela and in Canada. And you know, we've heard a lot from the Western media and from the West about Venezuela, and we decided it's a good idea for us to come in and see it ourselves. And you know, I'm glad we did. I think it was the right thing to do. I am certainly leaving with a completely different impression. I mean, you know, the reality is...
Just explain that to a little bit more. Why?
Let's find a country in the world that built 2 million homes in a short period of time. Find a country that's
public sector homes, which...
Absolutely. That, you know, we're giving free to people. They don't do that in the United States or in Canada. In fact, you know, we have homeless people in both countries. We still have issues with respect to the indigenous people in our country that we're still trying to fix. And, you know, our government is doing as much as they can, but they could do more and they should do more. So the reality is the interfering in Venezuela, in the democratic process of Venezuela is wrong, and I think it needs to be stopped.
But how
The
do you explain
embargo
it?
is
How do
wrong.
you explain that disconnect, that hostility which seems to exist in the minds of so much of the
Well,
the
unfortunately,
mainstream media?
I think the reality is there is an attack on a socialist country. They do not like that. They want this country to be controlled by the banks, to be controlled by the corporations, and to be controlled by big business. And that is very unfortunate.
You were talking about the links between unions in Canada and here in Venezuela.
Yes.
What exactly? What are you doing? What kind of links exist?
Well, this is our first meeting with the unions here in Venezuela. We are meeting again, hopefully on Monday tomorrow, to talk about establishing a relationship, trying to have them visit our country, and also talk about what we could do to help.
What kind of things do you have in mind?
Well, UNIFOR is as I mentioned, the largest private sector union in Canada. I'm also the director of the Social Justice Fund, where we have 100 projects in Canada and in 44 different countries.
This is a social justice fund from UNIFOR?
Yes, absolutely. Paid for by employers. And
paid for by the employers, not by the employees?
Absolutely. Paid for by the employers through collective bargaining. So we bargain that with the employers. And what we do is we have projects that deal with human rights, labor rights.
Within Canada and abroad?
70% international and 30% domestic. And what we do is we work with other organizations, global unions, international unions, organizations like the Red Cross, Oxfam, etc. And we're quite proud of that fund, for sure.
So do you have any specific projects you're hoping to take up with that?
It is too early to talk about a project in Venezuela. What we like to do is to establish a relationship and talk about what is it that we could do collectively to make sure that the workers in Venezuela benefit, whether it's training or education or other issues.
I want to come back to the elections.
Yes.
You know, as you well know, Canada, not only Canada, the United States, a whole number of countries have said quite aggressively they will not recognize the results of these elections. What can people like you, movements like yours, do to overcome that?
Well, we've sent a letter to the government of Canada a few months ago against the embargo and against the sanctions against Venezuela. We clearly said that our union and many other unions in Canada does not accept such policy. We think it's wrong, we think it's interference, and we think it's only hurting the people of Venezuela. It is hurting the little guy on the street, and it is absolutely wrong. We truly believe that there is a need for Canada to reconsider this policy and to make the right change. We believe they should recognize the will of the people of Venezuela, and the will of the people of Venezuela will be decided today, and that's what they should accept.
Mohammed, I just wanted to interrupt you a moment because I think my colleagues in Quito, Soini and Camila, wanted to ask you a question. Now, unfortunately, you can't hear them directly, so they'll have to ask the question through me, I'm afraid.
Okay, hello, Mohammed. What I wanted to ask was, it seems as if there aren't even within the ranks of the other political parties, besides the government party, which is the Liberal Party of Canada, even within the NDP and other parties, it seems as if it's very difficult to speak out in support of the Venezuelan government or in support of the right of Venezuelans to vote. And I'm wondering if you've been following that and what you think about how difficult it is for, same with the Democrats in the U.S. are no different from the Republicans in terms of their stance on Venezuela and their attitudes towards this election.
So Camilla was just asking about not only the government party in Canada, but all of the parties, the mainstream parties in Canada, seem to find it very difficult to say anything positive about Venezuela. So how do you operate in that kind of an environment?
Well, again, that what I said apply to the government government and the opposition parties, I think there is a need for us to go back and make sure that we deliver the message about what we saw here, and that's exactly what we're going to do as Canadian delegations.
Right.
And we think, the policy need to change because we believe it's not fair. And the results of the vote today should be absolutely recognized and respected by not just the government of Canada, but by all governments in Europe and other countries who are, saying that they will not recognize the decision and the will of the Venezuelan people.
Well, I mean, what do you think the Venezuelan government can do about that? I mean, should it just ignore this attitude?
I think what they've been doing so far, and that is saying, look, we're prepared to sit down and talk. We believe our door is open to sitting down with the opposition, and I understand the president is suggesting that he's going to do mediation after and try to work things out, and I think that's the way to go. And I think instead of embargo and sanctions, I think the Canadian government could play a very good role in trying to bring the parties together and work with the Venezuelan government to help the Venezuelan people, instead of putting sanctions that will only hurt the people.
Okay, thank you. Soini and Camilla have another question for you, which I'm going to have to relay to you.
Just one more question, Mohammed. I was wondering if you've ever seen in Canada or in any other country that you know of such a festive mood as you said you saw in Venezuela, and maybe describe a little bit of what you saw there as someone who's not from Venezuela, and I believe this is maybe your first trip there during an election. How does this compare to what Election Day looks like in Canada?
So Camille is asking about the festive mood. Have you ever, in the various countries you visited, not Venezuela, have you ever seen an election held with this kind of festive mood, and how does it compare with the mood at a Canadian election?
I will not say that I have. I've been to a number of countries where I've seen elections, and no, I think people were quite excited today, and I think it does have something to do with the fact that they believe in their country being independent and have its own voice, and they reject the call from outside to interfere or to militarily take action against a country that want to have its own will and want to do its own thing without having other countries making decisions on their behalf.
Thank you very much, Mohammed.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
That's all from us for the moment, Soini and Camilla. Back to you in Quito.
Thank you so much for that, Ian Bruce. You've just seen Ian Bruce's interview with Mohamed Al-Sani. He's Canadian. He's an electoral observer, so he was there for today's elections.
Right, and he comes from Unifor, which is one of the largest union federations in Canada.
Okay, that's really important. So we have been talking for this first show, which is part of our extended coverage of the elections, the presidential elections 2018. We really thought it was important to talk to persons who have experience observing elections, specifically in Venezuela, and kind of give you some insight into the electoral culture there. So you got two questions in with Mohammed. Camilla, what you thought were some of the key takeaways from what he said to Ian?
I think it's really interesting that Mohammed talked about the need to kind of forge relationships with social organizations, grassroots organizations, the actual Venezuelan people, whether that be labor or any other group and demographic or sector of Venezuela, between, relations between Canadian citizens and people in Venezuela, because of course there is kind of a media blockade, as we've discussed in this show, and it's very difficult to get information, especially if you don't have roots in Latin America, especially if you don't understand Spanish language media. And so it's very important that these delegations go to Venezuela, and it's very important that alternative media exists in English. But to build these ties, I think was one of the most important things I heard him say, that not only do they have to inform people within their union, but also
Camila,
some of the other parties.
I need to interrupt you, but one of the things I really liked about what Mohammed said was the role of Canada. He said that Canada needed to take a different sort of role. We just saw that they did not allow Venezuelans who wanted to vote in Canada to vote. They absolutely banned the process there. And what Mohammed was saying is that they needed to be more conciliatory, like in the spirit, I guess, of the former Spanish Prime Minister Zapatero, who is making himself available to mediate in the Venezuelan political discussion. Now, this hour has passed really quickly. We've had a lot of conversation, but unfortunately, it's time now to bring an end to the first show of our extended coverage of the 2018 Venezuelan elections. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Soini Gray.
And I'm Camila Escalante, and thank you for joining us for this first hour after the poll close.